There is a statistic that most people hear and immediately forget because it is too uncomfortable to hold on to for very long. Nearly half of all marriages end in divorce. You have heard that number before. You have probably nodded at it, filed it away somewhere in the back of your mind, and continued with your day. But what that statistic doesn't tell you, what no headline, no social media post, no casual conversation about marriage ever seems to address, is the reason, the real reason. Not the surface reason that gets written on the legal documents. Not the reason people give at dinner parties when someone asks what happened. The real reason. The one that lives several layers beneath the story that gets told out loud. And here is what I have come to understand after years of working with couples at every stage of connection and disconnection. Most divorces are not caused by the things people think they are caused by. They are not caused primarily by infidelity, though infidelity is real and devastating. They are not caused primarily by financial stress, though money is one of the most consistent sources of tension in long-term relationships. They are not caused primarily by incompatibility, though that word appears on more divorce papers than almost any other. Most marriages end because of something that has no dramatic name, something that doesn't announce itself, something that builds so slowly, so quietly, so invisibly that by the time either partner realizes what has happened, the damage has been accumulating for years, sometimes decades. And this thing, this silent, unspoken, universally misunderstood thing, is what we are going to talk about today in more depth and with more honesty than most conversations about marriage ever allow. Stay with me. Because if you are in a marriage right now, if you are in a relationship that feels somehow off, somehow distant, somehow not quite the thing you thought you were building, what I am about to share with you may be the most important thing you hear this year. And if you are new to this channel, I want you to know that this is exactly what we do here. We go beneath the surface. We talk about the things that are real and uncomfortable and necessary. If that is the kind of conversation you have been looking for, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every video in this series is designed to take you somewhere deeper than you have been before. Now, let me tell you about a man named Marcos. Marcos was 42 years old when he sat across from me and said something that I have never forgotten. He had been married for 14 years. He and his wife Elena had 2 teenage children, a house in the suburbs that they had renovated together, a social life that others described as enviable. From the outside, their marriage looked like the kind that people point to as evidence that it can work, that love can last, that the thing you build together in your 20s can still be standing when you are well into your 40s. But Marcus was sitting across from me because the marriage was over. Not legally yet, not in any way that the people in their lives had been told, but emotionally it had been over for a long time. And what he said to me, the thing I have never forgotten, was this. I don't know when it happened. I don't know the day or the month or even the year. I just know that at some point I stopped feeling like her husband and started feeling like her housemate, and I never said anything about it, and neither did she. And now, here we are. 2 words that carry the weight of 14 years of unsaid things, 14 years of moments that passed without the conversation that should have accompanied them. 14 years of 2 people choosing, again and again, the comfort of silence over the discomfort of honesty, until the silence had become the entire architecture of the marriage. This is the thing that no one talks about. This is the thing that is quietly ending more marriages than infidelity and financial stress and incompatibility combined. It is the chronic avoidance of emotional honesty, the systematic, habitual, deeply human tendency to not say the thing that needs to be said, because saying it feels too risky, too vulnerable, too likely to open something that cannot be closed again. And I want to be very precise about what I mean by this, because emotional avoidance is not the same as being private. It is not the same as being introverted or choosing not to share everything or having healthy boundaries around your inner life. Emotional avoidance, in the context of an intimate partnership, is specifically the avoidance of the truths that are directly relevant to the health of the relationship. The things you feel about the relationship itself, the disappointments, the unmet needs, the growing fears, the quiet griefs, the accumulation of small moments where you felt something important and said nothing. Maybe this is already landing somewhere real for you. Maybe you're watching this and thinking about the last time you felt something in your marriage, something that mattered, something that needed to be spoken and didn't say it. Maybe you're thinking about the pattern of not saying it, the weeks and months and possibly years of feelings that have been felt privately, processed privately, grieved privately, while your partner sat across the room from you, equally private, equally silent, equally alone, inside a marriage that was supposed to be the one place where you didn't have to be alone. That is the thing no one talks about. That is the thing that ends marriages while both partners are still trying to keep them going. But before we go deeper into why this happens, and it is important that we understand why, because the why is where the possibility of change lives, I want to paint a picture of what this avoidance actually looks like in the daily texture of a marriage, because it doesn't look like what you might expect. It doesn't look like coldness or cruelty or obvious disconnection. It looks most of the time like a perfectly functional life. It looks like Marcus and Elena on a Sunday morning, moving around their kitchen with the easy choreography of people who have shared a space for years. She makes coffee. He reads something on his phone. The children come downstairs in stages. Breakfast is assembled and consumed. Plans for the day are discussed. Practical, logistical, efficient. And then the day begins, and the two of them move through it in parallel, competent and coordinated. And at the end of it, they return to the same bed and lie in the same darkness and feel, each of them privately, the particular kind of loneliness that is only possible when you are lying next to someone you used to know completely. That Sunday morning looks fine. It looks like a marriage that is working, and in every way that can be measured from the outside, it is. But inside it, in the space between those two people, in the absence of what is not being said, something is dying, slowly, quietly, without announcement. This is what chronic emotional avoidance looks like from the inside of a marriage. And the reason it is so dangerous, so much more dangerous than a dramatic fight or a single act of betrayal, is that it is invisible. It accumulates without leaving visible marks. It does its damage in the negative space, in the conversations that don't happen, in the needs that don't get named, in the feelings that don't get witnessed. And by the time it becomes visible, by the time it surfaces as coldness or distance or the flat statement that you have grown apart, it has usually been building for so long that both partners are exhausted before the real work has even begun. So why does this happen? Why do two people who chose each other, who made promises to each other, who built a life with each other, why do they fall into this pattern of sustained emotional silence? Why does the honesty that felt so natural in the beginning of the relationship become the hardest thing in the world as the years go on? The answer has several layers, and I want to take you through each one carefully, because each layer reveals something important, not just about what is happening, but about what can be done about it. The first layer is what I call the calcification of safety. In the early stages of a relationship, honesty is relatively easy because the stakes feel lower. You are still discovering each other. You are still in the phase where vulnerability feels exciting rather than terrifying, where showing yourself to this person feels like an act of intimacy rather than an act of risk. And crucially, you have not yet accumulated a history of having been hurt by this person's response to your vulnerability. But as the relationship matures, that history begins to accumulate, not necessarily through dramatic betrayals, more often through those small, repeated experiences of reaching out and not quite being met, of sharing something tender and having it minimized or met with distraction or responded to in a way that felt slightly off. Not cruel, but not quite right either. Of being vulnerable and feeling afterward that the vulnerability cost you something, that it left you slightly more exposed than you wanted to be. These moments are small. Each one, in isolation, is easily explained away. He was tired. She was distracted. It was a bad moment. You're being too sensitive. And so you explain it away and you move on, and the next time something needs to be said, you remember, at some level below conscious thought, that saying it comes with a risk, and the risk feels slightly higher than it did before. And so you hesitate, and sometimes you say it anyway, and sometimes you don't. And the times you don't, the silence grows a little thicker, a little more habitual, a little more like the default. This is how the calcification happens, not through one decision to stop being honest, but through thousands of tiny recalibrations, each one rational, each one self-protective, each one making complete sense in the moment, that gradually shift the emotional climate of the marriage from one of openness to one of managed distance. And here is the layer that sits beneath that one, the one that almost no one identifies, even in therapy, even in the most honest conversations they have about their marriages. The avoidance is not just about protecting yourself from the other person's response. It is also, and often more powerfully, about protecting the other person from what you really feel. This is the part that Marcus could barely articulate when we first started talking, because when I asked him why he had never told Elena that he felt like her housemate rather than her husband, why, over the course of years of feeling that way, he had never once said it out loud, his first answer was the predictable one. He was afraid of her reaction. He didn't want a fight. He didn't want things to get worse. All of that was true. But when we sat with it longer, when we went past the first layer of the answer, something else emerged. He said, I think I also didn't want her to feel like she had failed. I didn't want her to feel like the marriage was her fault, because she was trying. She was doing everything she was supposed to do, and I didn't know how to tell her that it wasn't enough without making her feel like she wasn't enough. This is the hidden face of emotional avoidance. It is not always cowardice. It is sometimes a twisted form of protection, a misguided kindness, a love that expresses itself as silence because it cannot find a way to be honest without causing pain. And the devastating irony of this, the thing that breaks my heart every time I encounter it, is that the silence offered as protection causes far more pain in the long run than the honesty it was designed to prevent. The pain of feeling unwanted is far deeper and more lasting than the pain of hearing something difficult, the pain of not knowing what is wrong, of sensing the distance without being able to name it, is far more corrosive than the pain of a hard conversation. But the person inside the avoidance cannot see that, because they are managing the present moment, not the long arc of the relationship. And in the present moment, staying silent feels like the kinder, safer, more manageable choice. There is something else happening here too, something that operates even deeper than the protection of the other person, something that has roots that go all the way back to childhood, to the very earliest experiences of being in relationship with other people. And this is where the work gets genuinely transformative, if you are willing to go there. Most of us learned long before we ever entered a romantic relationship that certain emotions were acceptable and certain emotions were not. We learned this through the responses of our earliest caregivers, through the messages, spoken and unspoken, that we received about which feelings were welcome and which needed to be managed or hidden. Some of us learned that anger was dangerous, that expressing it led to punishment or withdrawal or an atmosphere of threat that felt unsafe. Some of us learned that sadness was a burden, that showing it made the people we loved uncomfortable, or led to being told to pull ourselves together, or resulted in a kind of pity that felt worse than the sadness itself. Some of us learned that need was weakness, that asking for things, wanting things, depending on others for emotional support was a form of fragility that invited rejection or contempt. And whatever we learned, whatever the specific emotional lesson of our particular childhood, we carried it with us into every relationship we formed, into our marriages, into the daily moments of choosing whether to speak or to stay silent. Marcus had learned as a boy that expressing emotional need made him a burden. His father was a man who dealt with his own emotions through humor and deflection, and who responded to emotional expressions in his children with a kind of gentle but unmistakable dismissiveness. Nothing he could point to as damage. No cruelty, no abuse, no dramatic failure of parenting. Just a consistent message delivered across thousands of small interactions over the course of childhood that feelings were slightly embarrassing, that the appropriate response to emotional difficulty was to handle it quietly and move on. And so Marcus had grown into a man who handled things quietly and moved on, who was exceptionally competent at managing his own interior life, who could feel things deeply and process them privately and emerge on the other side without ever having needed anyone else to witness the process. This was not a flaw. In many contexts it was a strength, but in a marriage, in the specific context of a relationship that requires ongoing emotional disclosure to stay alive, it was the thing that was slowly killing everything. Maybe you recognize something of yourself in Marcus. Maybe the lessons you learned about emotions in the family you grew up in have shaped, more than you realized, the way you show up or don't show up emotionally in your marriage. Maybe the silence you have been keeping is not simply a habit of the present, but a pattern that was formed long before your partner ever entered the picture. This is the layer that changes everything when you truly understand it, because it means the problem is not your partner. It means the problem is not the marriage specifically. It means the problem is a pattern, a learned, deeply ingrained pattern of emotional management that you brought into the marriage and that has been running largely on autopilot ever since. And patterns that were learned can, with the right understanding and the right tools, be changed. But there is a layer still beneath that one, a layer that is perhaps the most important of all for understanding why this particular problem, chronic emotional avoidance, ends so many marriages that could have been saved. And it has to do with something that researchers who study long-term relationships have identified as one of the single most important factors in whether a marriage survives: the ability to tolerate the discomfort of the other person's emotional experience without either withdrawing from it or being overwhelmed by it. This is what psychologists call emotional regulation in relationship. The capacity to remain present with your partner's pain, frustration, need, or vulnerability without either shutting down or flooding. And it is a capacity that is far less common than we tend to assume, because it requires a level of internal stability that most people were not taught to develop. When Elena expressed frustration, which she did, more and more rarely as the years went on, because she had learned that her frustration made Marcus go quiet in a way that felt punishing, Marcus experienced something that he could not have named at the time, but that we might describe as emotional flooding. Her frustration activated in him a cascade of internal responses: the fear of failing her, the shame of not being enough, the helplessness of not knowing how to fix what was wrong, the reflexive urge to withdraw from the overwhelming sensory and emotional experience of her distress. And so he would go quiet. He would become efficient and practical and slightly remote. And Elena, watching him go quiet, would interpret his withdrawal as indifference, as evidence that her feelings didn't matter to him, and would feel something that she also could not name, but that we might describe as the particular despair of a person who has been made to feel that they are too much. And then she would go quiet too, because going quiet felt safer than continuing to speak into a silence that felt like rejection. And the two of them would sit in their mutual quiet, each one privately drowning in feelings they had decided were not safe to share, each one interpreting the other's silence through the lens of their own worst fear. This is the dance. This is the specific, devastating, extraordinarily common pattern that sits at the heart of most marriages that are quietly falling apart. Not a failure of love, not a failure of commitment, a failure of the emotional skills, the specific, learnable, genuinely teachable skills that long-term intimacy requires. And if you have been sitting with this video thinking, yes, this is us, this is exactly what is happening in our marriage, and I don't know how to stop it, I want you to hold on to that recognition. Because recognition is not a small thing. Most people never get this far. Most people explain away the distance, manage the discomfort, tell themselves it is just a rough patch, and continue the pattern for another year, another 5 years, another decade, until one morning one of them says, "Here we are," in a voice that carries all the weight of everything that was never said. You are not there yet. You are here, which means you are still looking, still asking, still somewhere, between the beginning of the understanding and the beginning of the change. And that is exactly where transformation becomes possible. I have put together something specifically for this moment, for the person who has recognized the pattern and is ready to do something more structured than watch videos about it. My ebook is called The Shadow of Marriage, and it was built around exactly what we are discussing today. It contains a detailed framework for identifying the specific emotional avoidance patterns operating in your marriage, where they come from, how they manifest, and what concrete steps interrupt them. It contains communication exercises that are designed specifically for couples who have been in patterns of mutual silence, exercises that begin gently, that don't require both partners to be emotionally ready at the same moment, and that gradually rebuild the capacity for the kind of honest exchange that intimacy requires. The link is in the description below, and I will come back to it before this video ends. But right now, there is something even deeper I need to show you, because understanding why the avoidance happens is only half of the picture. The other half, the half that is almost never discussed, is understanding what the avoidance costs. Not in abstract terms, not in the language of statistics or relationship research, but in the specific, personal, intimate terms of what it actually takes from the two people living inside it. What chronic emotional avoidance costs a marriage is not simply intimacy, though it costs that. It costs identity. When you have been managing your emotional experience privately, when you have been feeling things and not saying them, needing things and not asking for them, grieving things and not naming them, for long enough, something happens to your sense of self inside the relationship. You begin to disappear, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone can see from the outside, but in the slow, quiet way of a person who has stopped being witnessed, who has stopped being known in the deepest sense of that word, by the one person who was supposed to know them most. Elena described this to me in a way I found heartbreaking in its precision. She said, "I used to know who I was when I was with Marcus. And then, somewhere along the way, I became just the person who kept things running. I became a role, and I couldn't tell you when I stopped being a person to him and started being a function. I just know that one day I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me, not because I had changed, but because I had stopped being seen for so long that I had forgotten what I looked like when someone was actually looking." That is what emotional avoidance costs, not just the marriage, the self. And this is the point. This is the exact point, where everything in a marriage can change, or not change, where the accumulated weight of all the unsaid things either breaks something permanently or becomes the very thing that, when finally spoken, reveals that there was always more love here than either person knew. Aqui está a parte 2, continuação e conclusão. There is a moment in almost every marriage that has been living inside chronic emotional avoidance. A moment that arrives without warning, that cannot be planned for or predicted, that simply happens in the middle of an ordinary day, when the weight of everything unsaid becomes too heavy to carry anymore. It is not always a dramatic moment. It does not always announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors, or the kind of confrontation that marks the beginning of the end in movies. More often, it is quiet, almost unbearably quiet. A moment when one person simply stops performing the marriage and stands still in the truth of what they have been feeling for a very long time. For Marcus, that moment came on a Tuesday evening in November. Nothing particular had happened that day. There was no fight, no incident, no identifiable trigger. Elena was in the kitchen. He was sitting at the dining room table with a work document open in front of him that he had not looked at in 20 minutes, and something in him, some internal structure that had been holding the weight of years of unsaid things, quietly gave way, not with collapse, with clarity, the sudden, undeniable clarity of a person who has finally stopped pretending that what is true is not true. He closed his laptop. He sat with it for a moment, and then he did something he had not done in longer than he could remember. He got up, walked into the kitchen and said to his wife, "I need to tell you something." And I need you to not try to fix it or respond to it right away. I just need you to hear it." Elena turned from the counter, and whatever she saw in his face, whatever quality of stillness or seriousness was there, made her put down what she was holding and give him her full attention, not defensively, not braced for attack, simply present in the way that people become present when they sense that something real is about to happen. And Marcus said, "I have been lonely. Inside this marriage for a long time, I have been lonely. Not because of anything you have done wrong, not because you haven't tried, but because I stopped telling you what was actually happening inside me a long time ago. And I think you stopped telling me too. And I don't want to keep living like that. I don't know how to fix it yet. But I needed to say it out loud, to you, because I am done pretending it isn't true." The silence that followed was not the silence they were used to. It was not the silence of two people managing their distance. It was the silence of two people standing in the same truth at the same time, and finding, in that shared exposure, something they had both forgotten was still there. Elena did not respond immediately. She stood at the counter, and something moved across her face that Marcus had not seen in years. Not anger, not defensiveness. Something more fragile than that. Something that looked, he would tell me later, like relief. She said, "I didn't know you still felt lonely. I thought you had stopped caring." And Marcus said, "I thought you had stopped caring too." Two people, 14 years. The same loneliness, the same fear, the same misreading of the other's silence, each one interpreting the distance as indifference rather than as the mirror image of their own unexpressed pain. This is the moment that changes everything, not the long build-up to it, not the years of accumulation. This specific moment, when the avoidance breaks, when the first honest sentence is spoken, when two people discover that the silence they have been keeping was not a sign that the love was gone, but a sign that neither one of them knew how to speak in a way that felt safe enough to risk it. I want to stay with this moment because it contains something essential that I need you to understand about the possibility of repair. Because when most people imagine having this conversation, when they imagine finally saying the true thing to their partner, they imagine it going wrong. They imagine the defensiveness, the counterattack, the escalation into the kind of fight that leaves both people more wounded than they were before. And that fear, that entirely reasonable experience-based fear, is one of the primary reasons the conversation never happens. But what the research on relationship repair consistently shows is that the outcomes of these conversations depend almost entirely not on the content of what is said, but on how it is said, on the emotional posture of the person saying it, on whether the words come from a place of attack or a place of genuine vulnerability, on whether the message underneath the message is "you have failed me" or "I have been afraid to need you." These are not the same message. They land completely differently, and the difference between them is not rhetorical. It is not simply a matter of choosing softer words to say the same thing. It is a difference in the fundamental orientation of the speaker. It is the difference between a person who is using honesty as a weapon and a person who is using honesty as an offering. Marcus's words to Elena were an offering, not perfectly crafted, not delivered with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed them, but genuine and vulnerable and, crucially, free of accusation. He did not say, "You have made me feel lonely." He said, "I have been lonely." He did not say, "You stopped showing up for this marriage." He said, "I stopped telling you what was happening inside me." He took ownership of his own side of the pattern without performing false responsibility for hers, and that ownership, that willingness to be accountable without being self-flagellating, is what made it safe enough for Elena to respond with her own truth rather than with her defenses. This is the architecture of the conversation that can change a marriage, and it is learnable. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because one of the most damaging myths about emotional communication is that some people are naturally good at it and others are not, that the ability to have this kind of honest, non-defensive, vulnerable exchange is a personality trait rather than a skill. It is a skill. It is a specific, identifiable, practicable skill that can be developed through deliberate effort, even by people who have spent decades avoiding exactly this kind of conversation. The foundation of that skill is what researchers call differentiation, the capacity to remain connected to your own emotional experience while staying present in the emotional experience of another person. To feel what you feel without being overwhelmed by it. To witness what your partner feels without either withdrawing from it or being consumed by it. To hold both experiences simultaneously without collapsing the distinction between them. This sounds abstract. Let me make it concrete. When Marcus said, "I have been lonely," and Elena felt the sting of that, felt the implication that she had not been enough, that the marriage she had been tending had failed in some way she hadn't known about. The differentiated response was not to suppress that sting. It was not to pretend it wasn't there. It was to feel it, to acknowledge it internally, and to choose not to act from it. To recognize, this feeling is mine. It belongs to my history, to my fears, to the story I tell about what it means when someone I love is in pain. It does not belong to this conversation. I can set it aside long enough to actually hear what my husband is saying. That is differentiation in practice, and it is extraordinarily difficult for most people, not because they are emotionally deficient, but because no one taught them how to do it. Because the educational system, the cultural narratives, the family environments most of us were raised in, none of them included instruction in this fundamental human skill. We were taught to read and write and calculate and memorize. We were not taught how to stay present in an emotionally charged moment without either flooding or shutting down. But here is what makes this learnable rather than simply aspirational. Differentiation is not something you achieve once and then possess forever. It is something you practice moment by moment, conversation by conversation. You will fail at it. You will flood, or you will shut down, or you will say the thing you meant not to say and have to come back from it. And coming back from it, the willingness to repair, to try again, to say, "I didn't handle that well and I want to try again," is itself a form of the skill. Every repair is a practice. Every attempt, even the failed ones, is building something. This is the thing I most want people to understand about the work of rebuilding a marriage that has been living inside emotional avoidance. It is not a process of having one transformative conversation and arriving on the other side changed. It is a process of practicing new behaviors, repeatedly, imperfectly, with patience, and without the expectation of immediate results. It is slow. It is sometimes discouragingly slow. But it is real, and it is cumulative, and it builds on itself in ways that eventually become visible. Marcos and Elena did not resolve everything that night in the kitchen. That conversation was not the end of the work. It was the beginning of it. In the weeks that followed, there were moments of regression, moments where the old patterns reasserted themselves with the full force of their 14-year habituation. There were evenings where Marcus went quiet again, where the glass came back up and Elena could feel him retreating behind it, and where she felt the old familiar despair beginning to rise. And there were evenings where Elena flooded, where the accumulated grief of years of feeling unseen broke through the surface in ways that overwhelmed them both, that felt too big for the room, that made Marcus's nervous system do exactly what it had always done in the face of her emotional intensity. But something was different now. Something had shifted in the fundamental orientation of both of them toward the marriage. Because they had both said the true thing, because the silence had been broken, the thing that had been unsayable had been said, and the saying of it had not destroyed them. It had, in fact, revealed something they had both given up on finding, evidence that the other person was still there, still caring, still, underneath all the management and the distance and the mutual performance of a marriage that was working, wanting the same thing, that evidence changes everything. Because hopelessness is the actual enemy of a marriage in crisis, not conflict, not distance, not even the accumulated weight of years of avoidance. Hopelessness, the quiet, private conviction that the other person has checked out, that the investment is not mutual, that you are the only one who still cares about what happens to this thing you built together. And hopelessness thrives in silence. It grows in the absence of information. It fills the space left by the conversations that don't happen with the worst possible interpretation of what the silence means. When the silence breaks, when the true thing is finally said, and the response reveals that the other person is still there, still feeling, still in it, the hopelessness loses its ground. It doesn't disappear overnight, but it loses its certainty. An uncertainty in a marriage that has been operating on the false certainty of mutual indifference is an extraordinary gift. Now I want to talk about what comes after the conversation, because this is where most couples, even the ones who manage to break the silence, even the ones who have the breakthrough moment in the kitchen or the bedroom or the therapist's office, tend to struggle, because the breakthrough creates a window. And windows, if they are not climbed through quickly and deliberately, close again. The old patterns are patient. They have been there longer than the new intention, and they will reassert themselves at the first opportunity if the new intention is not backed by specific, consistent, deliberate action. The specific action that matters most in the immediate aftermath of a breakthrough conversation is this: the creation of a new container for ongoing honesty, not a single conversation, but a structure, a regular, protected, mutually agreed upon space in which both partners commit to the practice of emotional disclosure, not the performance of it, not the processed therapeutic version of it, but the messy, uncertain, real-time version. I noticed something this week and I want to tell you about it before it becomes another thing I am managing privately version. This does not need to be elaborate. Marcus and Elena started with something almost embarrassingly simple: a weekly 20-minute conversation on Sunday evenings after the children were in bed, in which each of them answered 3 questions. What did I feel this week that I almost didn't tell you? What did I need this week that I almost didn't ask for? What did I appreciate about you this week that I almost didn't say? 3 questions, 20 minutes, once a week. It sounds insufficient for the scale of the problem, and in the beginning, it felt insufficient. The answers were stilted and self-conscious, the way any new practice feels before it becomes natural. Marcus found the exercise uncomfortable in the way that all forms of structured vulnerability are uncomfortable for people who have spent their lives being self-sufficient. Elena found it insufficient. She wanted more. She wanted the floodgates to open. She wanted 14 years of unexpressed feeling to be released in a single Sunday evening conversation. And the careful, measured format of 3 questions felt like a container too small for what was inside her. But they kept doing it, week after week, through the discomfort and the insufficiency and the moments where it felt like they were performing intimacy rather than actually experiencing it. And something happened over the course of those weeks that I have seen happen in couple after couple who commit to exactly this kind of consistent, low-pressure practice. The container began to expand. The answers got longer. The self-consciousness faded. The questions stopped feeling like a format and started feeling like a genuine inquiry. And the Sunday evening conversations began to spill over into the rest of the week, into moments during ordinary days when one of them would say something true without waiting for Sunday, because the practice had begun to rebuild the neural and emotional pathways that make spontaneous honesty feel possible. This is how new patterns are built, not through epiphanies, but through repetition, not through the single dramatic gesture, but through the accumulation of small, consistent acts of choosing honesty over management. Each one is a brick, and the wall that those bricks are building, the wall of genuine mutual witnessed knowing, is the actual structure of an intimate marriage, not the romantic feeling, not the chemistry, the knowing, the being known. And here is what I want to say to the person watching this who is thinking, this sounds right, but I don't know how to start. I don't know how to have the first conversation. I don't know how to say the true thing without it coming out as an accusation. I don't know how to stay present in my partner's emotional experience without either flooding or shutting down. I don't know concretely what the first step actually looks like. This is exactly where the structure of the ebook becomes valuable in a way that a video, however thorough, cannot fully replicate. Because the ebook takes everything we have discussed today, the psychology of emotional avoidance, the attachment patterns that drive it, the specific communication skills that interrupt it, the weekly practices that rebuild emotional intimacy over time, and translates it into a step-by-step guide that begins exactly where you are, not where you should be, not where you would be if you had been doing this work for years, where you are right now with all the history and the patterns and the fear and the love that you are actually carrying. It includes the exact framework for beginning the first honest conversation, the specific language structures that allow you to speak from vulnerability rather than from accusation, even when what you are feeling is closer to anger or grief than to calm. It includes a guided process for identifying your own emotional avoidance patterns and understanding where they come from, not to excuse them, but to make them visible enough to change. And it includes the 3-question practice that Marcus and Elena used, along with several variations designed for couples at different stages of disconnection and reconstruction. The link is in the description. If you have been watching this and recognizing your marriage in what I have described, if you have been sitting with the quiet weight of things you have not said, needs you have not named, a self that has been disappearing in the silence of a relationship that was supposed to be the one place you didn't have to disappear. This is the next step, not because a book can do the work for you, but because having a structure makes the work possible in a way that intention alone rarely does. Now, I want to come back to something I said near the beginning of this video. I said that most marriages end not because of the things people think they end because of, not primarily because of infidelity or financial stress or incompatibility. They end because of this, because of the chronic, habitual, deeply human pattern of not saying the true thing, of choosing the comfort of managed silence over the discomfort of honest speech, of protecting the other person and protecting yourself and protecting the image of the marriage, until the protection has consumed so much of the available space that the actual relationship has nowhere left to live. And I want to add something to that now, something that I think is the most important thing I can leave you with today. The marriages that survive this pattern are not the ones where both partners suddenly become perfect at emotional honesty. They are not the ones where the avoidance is eliminated entirely, where the old patterns never reassert themselves, where every difficult feeling is expressed with fluency and grace and perfect timing. The marriages that survive are the ones where both partners become willing to be bad at this, where they are willing to stumble through the uncomfortable conversation, to say the thing imperfectly, to flood or shut down, and then come back and try again, where they are willing to be clumsy in the service of being real, where they decide again and again that the discomfort of honesty is preferable to the comfort of a silence that is slowly taking everything. That willingness, that stubborn, imperfect, unglamorous willingness to keep trying, is not a romantic quality. It does not make for a compelling movie. But it is the actual substance of a lasting marriage. It is what love looks like when it has matured past the feeling and become a practice, a discipline, a daily choice made not because it is easy, but because the alternative, the slow, quiet erasure of two people who once chose each other, is simply not acceptable. Marcos and Elena are still married. I want you to know that because the story I have been telling you is not a tragedy. It is a story of two people who came very close to losing something that still mattered to both of them, and who found, almost too late but not quite, that the honesty they had been avoiding was not the thing that would destroy the marriage. It was the thing that had always been capable of saving it. Their marriage is not what it was in the beginning. It is something different, something more honest and in some ways more fragile. Because real honesty always carries the possibility of real pain, and they both know that now in a way they didn't when they were younger. But it is also something more solid, more genuinely intimate, more like the thing that marriage is supposed to be at its best, a relationship between two people who actually know each other, who have chosen to keep knowing each other, even as they change, even as the years accumulate and the easy chemistry fades and what remains is the harder, deeper, more durable thing. That is what is possible. That is what is on the other side of the conversation you have been avoiding. Not a perfect marriage, not a return to the beginning, but a real one, an honest one where you are seen, actually seen, by the person who matters most. If you are somewhere in the middle of this right now, if you recognize your marriage in Marcos and Elena's story, if you felt the weight of your own unsaid things while listening today, I want you to do something before you close this video. Not something big, something small. Write down somewhere private the one thing you have been most afraid to say to your partner. Not to send, not necessarily to say out loud yet, just to write down. to take it out of the dark interior where it has been living and put it somewhere you can see it. Because named things are less powerful than unnamed things. And the first step toward saying the true thing is always the act of knowing what the true thing actually is. And if you are ready for the structured next step, if you want a clear path from recognition to action, from awareness to actual change in the daily texture of your marriage, the ebook is waiting for you. The link is in the description. It is called The Shadow of Marriage, and it was made for exactly this moment. For the person who is done pretending the silence is fine. For the person who is ready, finally, to say the true thing, and to learn how to say it in a way that might, this time, actually be heard. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Turn on notifications, because this conversation continues, and every video in this series is another step on the same journey. Deeper, more honest, more useful than the last. You deserve a space where these things are spoken about with the seriousness and the care they require. This is that space, and I am glad you are here. Your story does not have to end in silence. The conversation that could change everything is closer than you think, and it begins, as all the most important things do, with a single, courageous sentence spoken out loud to the person who needs to hear it most.